Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to the second day of Humanity Rising's special program on the Conference of Parties that is going on as we speak in Glasgow, Scotland. We started yesterday with an amazing, I would say, panel of people both there in Glasgow and around the world who are actively, passionately concerned about climate change and what the world now needs to do to radically shift its current trajectory toward a level of global warming that could well cause the devastation of human civilization and possibly even the extinction of our species. There's a link in the chat if you can get it from the Washington Post yesterday, saying that we've now hit 420 parts per million of CO2 in the environment, up from pre-industrial levels of only 230. And we haven't hit this much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere for the last 3 million years. Just that tipping point alone says just about everything one needs to know about why the Secretary General of the United Nations, following on the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says that we are now in code red for humanity. We're now in the tipping point. And as the Washington Post article says in the first paragraph, we are now in irreversible warming. And we have to take this absolutely seriously. As Sir David King, one of the preeminent climate scientists in the world, has said repeatedly, we now have no more than 3 to 4 years to take the kind of radical ameliorating action that can put us humans on a new course in relationship to the larger ecosystem and the planet that we live on. So for these 12 days, Humanity Rising is dedicating itself to discussing various aspects of the climate. And today we will be hearing about carbon sequestration in relation to regenerative agriculture, one of the most powerful areas that could turn things around. We will be hearing from people in Glasgow in the course of the next 2 hours. So the format of the program will be a little bit spontaneous as we will be having a panel discussion on this theme. But as various people who were on the session yesterday come in from Glasgow with reports on what's happening, we will bring them in. You may have heard in the news that the more than 100 countries today have committed themselves to stopping methane releases, which is another massive area of challenge, and deforestation as we move into the future. But as is the case with all these agreements, it is vague with no specific timeline, and it's all voluntary. And that's one of the challenges that our governments are taking up, is how do you get nearly 200 countries, nearly 8 billion people in different areas of the world, different economic stages of development, to come into agreement around something that is really difficult to discern. And this may be the greatest challenge of the human race since our inception, to come together at this moment to take the kind of action that will preserve life on Earth and human civilization as we know it. So that's our program today. We'll be live tweeting everything out, as well as this broadcast over dozens of live streaming partners. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Before we begin our program, let us pause, as we always do on Humanity Rising, and just take a moment to just center ourselves in our bodies. Take a breath. And in the midst of all the tumult that is our world, let's just take a moment and close our eyes and attune ourselves with our hearts in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving that we're alive at this moment. Thank you, everyone. You know, it's a sobering thought, actually, that we are alive at this most consequential moment. It's worth reflecting that all of us were born for this moment. It's consequential because all of our choices matter, both what we do and what we don't do. Because collectively, over the next several years, humanity will be making decisions that will determine, literally, the fate of humanity on this earth. So it's in that spirit that we want to convene this program today. And we're going to start with Leslie Southwick Trask, the Chief Development Officer of Ubiquiti University, who's been working with Ed Muller, who's convening our program, and others. As over the last 18 months of Humanity Rising, we've been focusing on regeneration, which is the thematic that Ed has brought into Humanity Rising that gave rise to a whole new Masters in Regenerative Action. And then out of that has come, as we were internalizing the reality and the gravity of the IPCC report in Code Red, to the Global Regeneration Corps. How do we build a global network of regeneration first responders that can really get out there and make a regenerative difference globally at this critical moment? So each day, Leslie's going to tell us something a little bit more and different about the GRC. And then after she finishes, she'll turn it over to Ed Muller, who's been such a powerful presence in all of our deliberations, who's the CEO and founder of the University of International Cooperation, is a world specialist in biodiversity and regeneration, is one of the founders of Costa Rica Regenerative, and he will bring in and introduce our panel for today. But as I said, as this program unfolds, different people will be coming in from Glasgow, and so we'll be bringing them in as they have time. So thank you, everyone. And now, Leslie, I turn the program over to you.
Thank you, my friend. One of the things we know about hope is that we don't have it, we create it. And I think that in the seminal moment in time where the only way, social change isn't linear. It never is. It occurs only in tipping points. And as Jim has mentioned, we're in one in this moment. So I'm just going to take a few moments. I'm coming and greeting you from the traditional lands of the Natsitipi, and they are the Blackfoot Confederacy, Treaty 7 people. I think that it's easy to say, just join a group and you will find the way. But the question is, well, what group do you join? I mean, I don't know about you, but after yesterday, I felt like I had a fire hose of all the things that I needed to engage in and take action on and do in order for me to be a responsible human in this time of climate change, as a responsible mother, as a responsible grandmother, as a responsible individual. And so the GRC has been designed for sense making. It's to help us make sense of where and how we can take action in this seminal moment in time. I think many of you know that about 10 years ago, I walked out of my life, my very well-heeled, high consumptive corporate life in Canada, and entered into a rural farm in Portugal. And there I embraced 11 acres of abandoned land on the Camino de Santiago. Had I had the GRC in that moment, my life would have been much easier, because I had no idea what I was going to do with this land. I had people around me who were wonderful traditional farmers who themselves didn't know what to do with the increasing fall runoff and spring runoff of the mountainous waterways, who didn't know what to do with the droughts that were increasingly happening in the middle of the summer planting season. I stood there with them as my newly renovated 300-year-old farmhouse became flooded with knee-level silt from the water runoff in the spring. And they just tutted and said, that's the worst winter we ever had. Only to say the following winter, oh no, this is the worst winter we ever had. If I had known about GRC, I would have been able to have identified a pod, a group of cohorts with me who are living maybe close to me in my biosphere, or maybe in a similar biosphere elsewhere, where I would have been able to equip myself with what I needed to do and know in order to translate this beautiful piece of land into a regenerative, intentional community. Well, I did do it, but it took 3 unbelievably expensive years of many mistakes. And, like most of you are maybe sitting in a comfortable place in your home on the internet. In rural parts of the world, we go to cafes in the town to do our internet, where we sit for maybe half an hour in a buzz sound around us to try and get connectivity. And so it's not a matter of sitting luxuriously at home surfing the net. It's like 30 minutes. What am I going to find out? Where am I going to connect into? Who do I need to know? This is the reality of so many of us who are living in locations that are not as wired and not as comfortable as where I am sitting in today. Now, today, I'm now in what's known as Calgary, Alberta, where our provincial premier just lambasted our prime minister's declaration that we are going to put a cap on our carbon sector emissions. I'm living in the oil capital of Canada, and we all know what that means. So today, the pod that I would want to initiate is one where I am leaning into those who are absolutely fearful of where their job security is going to come from, where they don't have a clue as to how they're going to translate oil and gas skills into new energy skills. And while everybody on this panel may say, but that's easy, you just need to know X, Y, and Z, it is not easy if you don't know X, Y, and Z. How do we make sense of who we need to connect with and how we're going to connect with them? And As I said in my pod that I'm about to initiate, I will also want to do some emergency action because the heat wave, the fires, and the ongoing flooding in my province are going to go 5 times higher this next season. I will want to know what is the emergency measures that I can take that I would allow for me to be sharing with my community the kinds of help I can provide in those times when in point of fact, 500 people in this region died during the heat wave last summer while I had my computer on frozen vegetables to stop it from heating up. You know, what I'm saying to you is that the GRC, the Global Regeneration Corps, are for all of us as first responders, for us to identify the challenges that we're facing. And for many of us, it's about emergency measures in the times that we're going to need to use them. When the air quality outside is not sufficient in my province for even my granddaughter to spend her summer outdoors. How do I help a 6-year-old in the summer when she can't go outside? You know, pods are about learning just that. They are designed by us, for us, with other like-minded people who are looking for solutions in a time of rapidly escalating change. A pod is made up of 5 to 8 people that we then become a cohort and we equip and learn together. We're going to be able through the Ubiverse to access the just-in-time learning that we need in order to do the work of regenerative action in our community and to make impact. That there are all types of other places to get backpacks that we're going to coordinate and ensure that we are the most skilled and the most capable of any generation, all generations, to take this on. So where do you start? You start by going on to the GRC, the Global Regeneration Corps.com website, and you enter and take action as signing in as an individual. But if you're like me, I want to know who's out there that can connect with me. How can I become part of a pod? Well, I would go into the GRC group on Ubiverse. And if I'm really knowing that, you know what, I don't know what I don't know, I would create a profile on the GRC Hive. I'll be putting the link into that. On the Hive, you get to create your own position in the GRC in terms of your challenges, your projects, your skills, your location, your networks. And next week, you will see how you are connected to others around the world around those same challenges, those projects, those networks, those skills. You see, it's about making the invisible visible. And we can't take action if we don't know who. And we can't really do something of meaning if we don't know how. And that is what the GRC is. It's sense making. It's sense making for taking action. So join us, come in as an individual, find your peeps, and let's take this world on. It is my pleasure to then bring now Ed, my friend, my hero. I think this is called Ed and his fan club today because, but you know what, Ed, you come by it so honestly. I get to hang out with Ed a lot, and he never ceases to amaze me. Not just what he knows, but the hope that you carry, Ed, that you give tough stuff in terms of what we need to know. And then right on the heels, you give us the solution. So something that we can do that will make it a better way forward. So your high kindness, your richness of heart, your love, I turn it over to you, my friend.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you, Jim, for making this happen. And thank you to my great panelists. The best part about these webinars is that we're dealing with friends. We're actually having fun together while we bring to you who's out there listening. I think basically the best people in the world right now that can actually change things around. And that's what we'll do today. I'll do the introductions as we go through the different sessions. I just wanted to give a brief positioning of where we are and just for us to have a framework of why it is so important. So yes, we are in code red, And we've been in code red for a long time. But just now the United Nations language decided to be more explicit and less careful. Until very few years ago, the filtering in the language was, oh, let's not get the corporate sector mad. Let's not create panic. Well, we should have. So we are in code red in terms of climate change. But hardly anybody noticed that the Convention on Biological Diversity just happened a month ago. And the report said that none of the countries got even close to getting to the 20 simple targets we set back in Nagoya in 2010 to save the planet. And as Antonio Guterres says, it's the end of the functioning planet the way we see it. It's a collapse, and we are going to lose out on this. But we have the solutions, and to be able to have the solution, we really need to understand that we need to unlearn, and that's probably the most difficult part humanity has, unlearn from a very reductionist science, a very, I would say, very darkly linked science with policy and politics and business and money. Because the news is out there, we know exactly what's happening. And if we think of how our future will be, one of the biggest problems, aside from the unlearning, the reductionist approach that humans have today, is we're not trained to think exponentially. So we still think we have another 50 years time to actually change things around. And the way that graph is pointing up now, that time isn't there anymore. So are we going to expect something important from Glasgow? I'm not really sure. How many thousands and thousands of people have come together since Stockholm to change things around? And it just hasn't happened. And I don't think it will happen. It's not at that level. The UN can keep on doing its efforts. Governments can try to do something. Corporates, well, according to SDG 17, they're the solution to the collapse of the planet, because they know how to change things, but they're not doing it. So actually, I think the biggest result we expect from Glasgow is civil society taking the lead and making the changes. If we look at the strategies, what's being discussed, and this is even in my country, the decarbonization strategy that Costa Rica launched a few years ago, it's based on electrifying transportation. Yeah, and I don't have anything against electric cars. I actually have one just like that one in the picture. But I don't think there will be the solutions. And now we start seeing, yeah, it's not only CO2, it's methane and it's cows. So we're still in this reductionist vision and trying to decarbonize by reducing emissions. And it's our aspirations. It's what we've been taught to appreciate. Singapore is a marvelous city. It's supposed to be the example for other cities to follow. You look at Singapore, its ecological footprint exceeds by 10,000% its biocapacity. And the only places that still have a larger biocapacity than the footprint are very poor countries. So when you look at Kate Raworth's donut and you think, oh, Norway is a developed country. No, it's a tremendously underdeveloped country, just like Japan, Germany, many of the OECD countries, because yeah, they have a perfect social threshold. The development in the social and economic aspects is beautiful, education, health, and whatever. But at what cost? Way beyond their country ceiling, the ecological ceiling of the country. So I think these models show us which countries are really underdeveloped, because these are not the standards that we need for the planet. So we really need to think, and knowing that agriculture is responsible about 80% of global changes, we need to change the way we produce our food. And we have the science behind it. We can reverse climate change just by managing soil, and this is out there. Rodale came out with this white paper. If we would change our way of producing cattle to holistic grazing, regenerative grazing, however you want to call it, and you add regenerative cropping, we could actually fix almost 50% more than the yearly total emissions. This would give time for changing our fleet to electric, for reducing our energy consumption on fossil fuels. But we are not using these solutions. And this is what we're going to see today. And this is what should be actually on the forefront in Glasgow. With Larry, who's coming on today, we organized an event at the pre-COP in 2019 here in Costa Rica. And it was very difficult for me to get space to do a side event on carbon capture. Actually, I was at the time a member of the Scientific Council for Costa Rica for climate change. And my colleagues said I couldn't do this on the name of the 4C because there was too much discussion about the value of soil to fix carbon. So there we are. And we've seen these pictures, and we're going to have Abbey talk about regenerative grazing. Everything is out there. So I want to invite my good friend, Tom Newmark, to come right now and start the introduction of this. Tom is a really great speaker. He's one of the founders, co-founder with Larry of the Carbon Underground, but he also has a regenerative farm, and the backdrop is actually a drone picture of that beautiful farm that is, I mean, this is a food forest. And I live in a country that can be eaten. There's no reason to have poverty and hunger in Costa Rica because you can eat this country. So Tom, please.
Thank you so much, Eduard, and to everyone participating in Humanity Rising. Eduard asked me to set a biological, planetary foundation for the panel discussion. So I'm calling my talk, How to Deal with Legacy CO2, or Let's Honestly Deal with the trillion-ton elephant that is in the sky. What about this trillion-ton elephant? What do I mean by that? Well, you've heard that we're right now hovering around 420 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that pre-industrial levels were at approximately 280 parts per million. So that delta is 140 parts per million of CO2. That's the difference between life pre-industrial to life today. Each part per million of CO2 represents the transfer of carbon in the terrestrial zone into the atmosphere of 2 gigatons of carbon. So each part per million is 2 gigatons of carbon that has gone from the ground up into the atmosphere. So simple math, we are 140 parts per million greater now than in pre-industrial periods. That means that 280 gigatons, or billions of tons of carbon, has transferred from the ground and below ground into the atmosphere. 280 billion tons of carbon. Carbon dioxide is 3.67 times the weight of carbon. So you multiply 280 by 3.67, and you come up with approximately 1 trillion tons of legacy CO2 that humans have put into the atmosphere. Now, what are we going to do about that? Let's go back to carbon, the 80 billion tons of carbon. Eduard talked about how Costa Rica is looking to decarbonize the economy, but we obviously have to recarbonize something, because we've got to put those 280 gigatons of legacy carbon to work somewhere. What can we do with it? Well, you've heard talk, and in the chat room, there's reference to a Washington Post article that came out yesterday in advance of the COP gathering. And the article was captioned, "An Imperative to Act, Carbon Dioxide Added to the Atmosphere Takes Ages to Draw Down." And this was a gloomy article, the main points of which are: there's not enough room in all the above ground biomass on the entire planet to absorb this legacy CO2. There's not enough time for geological processes to work. There's not enough capacity in the ocean to absorb when we're already acidifying the ocean and there's not enough capacity to absorb enough to make a meaningful difference. And as to the magical thinking of carbon capture and storage, it notes that the most advanced current technology, the Orca carbon capture and storage plant in Iceland, well, it would take 9 million of those machines, costing about $15 million each, or frankly, hundreds of trillions of dollars, as if that technological magical thinking might work. So the article basically left us with there's no hope. But this discussion is all about what can humans do to rise up collectively, to have our consciousness act in a way that can meaningfully change and respond to our crisis. So the article forgot this thing called soil. And our soils currently utilize biologically 2,500 gigatons, 2,500 billion tons of carbon, more than the atmosphere and all above ground biomass put together. So if we're dealing with 280 gigatons of carbon in the air that we've got to deal with, the soil already has 2,500 gigatons at least at work. So adding 280 gigatons to the soil storage is only about an 11% increase in what the soils already are doing. That's just not that much. As regenerative farmers and ranchers around the world know, that's well within our reach. Is there biological, geological history for the planet Earth being able to do that? Well, consider the Ordovician period, about 480 million years ago. The ocean levels then were 180 meters higher than they are now. The average air temperature worldwide was 49 degrees C. The average ocean temperatures at the equator were as high as 43 degrees C, and CO2 parts per million were hovering around 4,000. And there wasn't much soil. It was basically rock and water, well, maybe a thin film of algae on that rock. But then something happened biologically. Then the convergence of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, bacteria, and plants in an exquisite evolutionary ballet were permitted plants to colonize the bare rock of Pangaea. And over the geological, biological time of the Ordovician period and following periods, the Silurian, the Devonian, what we were able to do with photosynthesis, drawing CO2 down from the atmosphere, converting CO2 into carbohydrates, satisfying the plant's metabolic needs with some of those carbohydrates, and then passing the carbohydrates out into the soil food web, feeding that soil food web, the microorganisms reproducing, excreting, and dying, creating necromass, which then adsorbs to the minerals in the earth and in the soil pores created by plant roots, depositing over time living soil with living carbon. How much? Well, we went from 4,000 parts per million in the atmosphere at the peak of the Ordovician period down to approximately 280 parts per million. Mother Earth has the capacity to do this. So as we hear other speakers today, consider the following. There are approximately 1.9 billion hectares of arable land. There are approximately 3.5 billion hectares of grassland. So over 5 billion hectares of grasslands. You will be hearing speakers today talking about farmers and ranchers able to draw down using photosynthesis, using the power of Mother Nature, draw down and integrate into the living tissue of Mother Earth 3 tons of carbon per hectare, 8 tons of carbon per hectare, 9 tons, 15 tons. It's happening all over the world. And with a footprint of 5 billion hectares, imagine what Mother Earth is capable of doing. Please, as we consider everyone's talk today, let us appreciate that Mother Earth has the power, has shown that she has the power to deal with extraordinary amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere. Let us never underestimate the power of Mother Earth to regenerate and to create a livable planet. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Tom. I don't know anybody that can tell that so well, so clearly in such a short time. Thank you. That was really inspiring. And if politicians would understand that in Glasgow, they would understand that we can solve the problems. Thank you. Yeah?
I just got a text from Rupert Reed in Glasgow that he's wanting to come in around now. So
go ahead.
We just so everybody knows that I'm waiting for him to come on. He's saying he's here, Rupert Reed, ready to report. I don't see him on the...
I'm promoting him to panelist. He joined as an attendee.
Oh, cool. Cool. Rupert Reed, everyone, is one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion and one of the founders of Transformative Adaptation. He's there in Glasgow. Rupert, welcome. Tell us what's happening.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, everybody. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Good. So, yeah, it's all pretty crazy here. It's also colder today. I'm taking a little break in the flat where I'm staying, and I thought I'd just drop in on you for a few minutes to give you a bit of update in terms of what's been happening. So, as you all may know, the first 2 days of COP26 are pretty important because they are the main days where the leaders are going to be present. This is flipped from the normal pattern with COPs. In the past, typically the leaders have always flown in at the end. The downside of that pattern has been that has meant that often there's been very little progress until right near the end, and then it's been a total seat of the pants operation, which, for example, in Copenhagen more or less failed famously. So I think one of the, I would say, relatively few smart moves that the UK government have made in setting up this COP is they flipped that around and they've had the leaders come at the start so that real progress can be made at the start. And then hopefully that can be followed up by the negotiators over the next 10 days. Now, another implication of this is that by the end of today, you will have heard, I would say, about 60–70% of all the actual kind of initiatives and outcomes that you're going to get from COP. So basically, by the end of today, and already to some considerable extent by this afternoon, it's about, 3:45 p.m. here in Scotland. We'll know quite a lot of the shape, frankly, of what the final agreement is going to look like, because we shouldn't expect vast progress after the leaders have left, because the leaders would want to sign off on any progress, and that's going to be very difficult once they're all scattered all over the world. Whoops. Sorry, I lost myself for a minute there. Okay, that's good. So what have we had today? Well, there's been a number of things. Somebody in the chat has mentioned methane, and that is one of the big headline deals here that's been announced. A new compact on dramatically reducing methane, which is, of course, much less important than CO2 as a warming gas because it stays in the atmosphere a lot less time, but is very important in the sense that it's been rising in a worrying way, and that while it's in the atmosphere, it's far more damaging than CO2. So the Methane Pact, well, it's reasonably encouraging, although it's quite striking that quite a lot of countries have not signed it. Quite a lot of the major countries, for example, Russia, where crucially a lot of it is coming from, although a lot of it's also coming from a lot of other countries, including the US, which has signed it. There's also always the question, of course, of how believable this pact is. Then there's been some progress on the question of deforestation and reforestation. That's another of the big headline items from today. In my view, the crucial thing that's being left out of that is the following tragic reality, which is that many of the forests which we're trying to grow or regrow, and rightly so, around the world now, they're going to burn. They're going to burn as the world temperature increases and we get more unstable weather, which will mean in some places, obviously, more extreme droughts, more extreme heat waves, such as has been experienced, obviously, in many parts of the global north, let alone the global south this year. My own view is that in the longer term, it's going to become increasingly important to seek to restore nature and sequester carbon in the oceans rather than on land. Obviously, we should do it on land, but I think the oceans are being neglected here. They're actually far more important, probably, because they're far bigger, and crucially, because if you grow green things in the ocean, they can't burn. So this is one of the realities that I think that world leaders have yet to come to terms with. It was encouraging to some extent to see what they've announced today on deforestation and reforestation. But if we're not going to have any serious progress on the oceans, well, then we're in very serious trouble. So I want to reiterate the key point that I want to pass on to you from today at the COP. By the end of today, and there won't be a lot more coming out later this afternoon, so we already know most of it. By the end of today, you will have definitely had the majority of progress in total that you're going to see in terms of formal agreements at COP26. And when you put it in that context, it's absolutely striking how little there is, and how, while it seems clear that this COP is, well, unlikely to go the way of Copenhagen, it's also unlikely to be as successful as Paris. And of course, what we needed at this COP was a drastic step change beyond Paris in terms of success and achievement. This state of affairs underscores what I said and what Bill McKibben said, and I think what Vandana Shiva said yesterday in our inaugural Humanity Rising gathering of this COP, which is that we're not going to get what we need out of this COP. And that really underscores the crucial importance of what I hope we'll come back to again and again during the coming days, of the need for us to respond appropriately to them not delivering enough. So those were the headlines I wanted to share. I'm just going to take a little look now at what's in the chat. But is that clear what I've said, folks? And is anyone who's here on the panel, any questions of clarification or responses to what I've said there?
Yeah, thank you so much, Rupert. Ed or Tom, any of you on the panel, do you want to interact with Rupert in any way?
Well, actually, Rupert, there was the climate change champions were working on a whole section of soil carbon building up to the COP, and I still haven't heard it get to the front stage. And we know now that it's basically the best solution we have at hand. That's what our webinar is about today. Have you seen or heard anything about soil carbon in the discussions?
No, I have not. And that is worrying, because I agree with you that in terms of the land, the oceans is a separate matter. But in terms of the land, I think that soil carbon is underrated and absolutely critical. Maybe they'll get their act together on it in the coming days. But like I say, don't get your hopes too much up for what's going to happen after today. The high-level champions, by the way, seem to me to be doing a pretty good job. And Nigel Topping, the UK one, is really quite serious. I'm optimistic that he may be willing to speak a little bit more frankly at the end of and after the end of COP about what hasn't been achieved. I really hope we get somewhere on soil carbon, but I'm afraid I've got, if there is progress, I'm not aware of it.
Mel, you have a question?
Well, I have a comment. He was mentioning the burning of the forests. It is going to get much worse. And as the forests burn, agroforests, forest gardens, forest belts in grasslands, et cetera, are going to be much, much more important. I'm going to be speaking more about that during my portion.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, one of the key things that is crucial is we need to try from now on much more self-consciously. While rewilding, we need to also try to design in principles of reducing the probabilifiers of forest combustion in whatever way we can. Because, yeah, I mean, this problem is only going to get worse. A really important example is the 400,000 hectare, I think it is, forest that Microsoft had in Oregon, that they had as their offset, right? So many businesses have been saying, oh, you know, we're going climate neutral, we're planting all these trees. Well, most of Microsoft trees went this summer, they burnt. So all that Microsoft's been saying over those years, it's not particularly Microsoft's fault that those specific trees went, although probably it is to some extent. They could have probably been more involved in making it less likely that they would have all burnt down. But anyway, you take my point, that's just an example, but it's quite a striking example. It's a huge amount of trees. Microsoft is a company that's been really priding itself on its getting closer to carbon zero. Well, those claims are just no longer credible. And the same accident, the same predictable accident, is going to happen to a bunch more companies and so forth in the coming years. Folks, if there's nothing else, I'm going to move on because there are things going on apace here. I will probably not be able to check in with you tomorrow, but I will try if I can. I've got a very busy afternoon tomorrow. Although the one thing that Jim and I might talk about actually off this call is whether I could sort of try beaming some stuff in from the Blue Zone tomorrow. That might be possible. If I don't get to speak to you tomorrow, I'll hope to speak to you on Thursday.
Good. Well, thank you, Rupert. Then beam in anytime.
All right. Good luck with the rest of your session here this afternoon. It sounds really good.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Before we return to the program, everyone, we've got Dita Vizzoso with us, who's also in Glasgow, who's just coming in. She is a climate activist, a farmer, a rewilder, participant in an organization called Grassroots to Global, and she's been there on the ground with some of the NGOs there in Glasgow. So, Dita, what's your report?
Thank you. Can you hear me well? I have some issues with my microphone recently, but it
Sure.
looks like it's okay.
We can hear you.
Great. I'm quite excited about the discussion today, not surprisingly, since soil is actually my passion. But I wanted, if I may comment just briefly on what Rupert was saying, I think a lot of the people I work with, we are not surprised that there may not be much coming out of the COP26 in the shape of action that will actually affect people. So the part I want to bring is something that I find quite hopeful, and I would love to share a screen for a story about a project called the Loving Earth Project, and it's a way of touching people into what they love about the earth or about something around them, and committing to make some actions. And some of them are very small, but I think that brings agency to everybody listening to this, not just people with land or access to politics or finances, but also some of the commitments have involved communities and are expanding. And it's one of the projects that is not limited to the COP26, but it's going to go further. So if it's okay, I would love to share a little.
Sure. Just share your screen.
Here we are. Share. There we are. So these are the questions that are asked of people, and people can make a panel that I'm going to show you. So the questions are: think of something you love, a place, a person, a thing. How will climate change and environmental breakdown affect them? What action is needed to reduce the risk of harm? And what will you do to help? And then people have created really beautiful panels using textiles and other materials, and they really, I've seen them. They are being exhibited in several parts of Glasgow. I invite people who are in Glasgow to go and have a look. There's a way of interacting. They're also offering workshops, and there is a set of these questions. You can bring them to your community and involve people. And some of the stories are really beautiful. So I would love to share something that Jo from, which is one of the curators of one of the exhibitions, was telling me about how she felt. So I am here with Jo. Hi.
Hi. Hi. Welcome to this exhibition we've got here in Gorbals Church just now, where people have been reflecting on what they love about the earth and what they care about and what they're trying to do in their own daily habits to make a difference. And they're also different, and they all have such different expressions and such creativity in them. And I think, apart from what they're expressing, I love creating things. I love doing lots of arty things with my hands. And sometimes we think, you know, what's happening in the world, the problems are so huge that, you know, we can't afford to keep doing all these daft things like playing with our hands. But actually, I think it's all the more important that we keep our creativity alive as a way of expressing how we are and how we're trying to engage with what's happening in the world, and how we try to still create things of beauty and find those tender moments that we get into the flow of our own humanity and do that in the presence of each other. And yeah, all the more so because of the big problems, we have to do those small, beautiful things that just keep our spirits singing. You know, what makes your soul sing? Do it. That's what the world needs as well, so that we can also feel resourced and feel courageous together to tackle the bigger things. Be part of a team. Be a team. Do it. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's one of the things that I like to highlight, because yeah, what's going to happen after the COP26? I think that's one of the places I want to put my efforts in. So that's all I want to share for today. There's a lot more that I have, but I think I would love to continue listening about soil and regeneration, which is also something that is happening in so many places of the world. Thank you, Jim, for bringing me in.
Thank you, Dita. Just quick question.
Yes.
Since you're there on the streets, as it were, with the citizen activists, what would you say the mood is? Is it kind of frenetic? Is it hopeful? Is it depressed? Is it angry? What's the atmosphere there like as you roam around the streets of Glasgow and go into the COP?
Well, it's quite remarkable. It's everything. So I've encountered people who are really down, really depressed, really frustrated, really angry. There's a lot of parts of Glasgow have a lot of police presence, and people feel, some of the people feel quite threatened and put down. And then I meet other people who are really full of good energy and doing all sorts of, in their own way. Some people are doing beautiful vigils to kind of bring this spiritual energy, and they're talking to other people. And I feel that there is that reflecting a lot of what's happening in the world as well, that there is this polarization that we see in most of the things that are happening: climate, COVID, the COP26. So that there is like an expansion of time and space where things get really like, or it's like an augmented reality is happening. So I sense that the nerves are really exposed, and some people manage to kind of be in a good space, and some people manage to actually touch the anger and that passion that I hope is going to come together in some way, so that things can happen. But I've seen everything. There's spaces that are really empty. There's some spaces that people are singing, people are having fun. There's some places where people are really angry, and I understand that everything is happening at the same time. So it's really mixed. Depending on where you land, you have a very particular view. I'm really happy that I have been kind of running around and seeing lots of different bits.
Great. Thank you so much, Dita. Thank you so much. Because what's happening outside the COP amongst the people is just as important as what's happening with Boris Johnson, Joe Biden, et cetera, there inside. So thank you so much and hope to hear from you again. So Ed, turn the program back over to you.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, this is like a live TV show. I'll pass it on right away to Larry. I know Tom and Larry have a hard stop, I think at 11. That's 1 hour from now. So I'll just pass it on to Larry. Larry, as I mentioned before, is co-founder of the Carbon Underground, but aside of that, he has a huge history in the corporate world, in the marketing world, but also one of the best speakers I've listened to. Actually, the short, very inspiring Kiss the Ground video is narrated by Larry. So whenever I'm missing Larry, I just put that video on and listen to his voice. Go ahead, Larry.
Thanks very much, Edward. It's an honor to be here talking to you all today. I had some slides I was going to show, and there was a problem with them. And I think that was the universe saying that when you talk from the heart, maybe it should come directly. So I want to talk about the fact that Humanity Rising, if you go to your website right now, what it says right on it is, what inspires you? Well, I'm going to ask, how about hope? And that's what I want to talk about. Leslie said earlier today that we don't have hope, we create hope. So let's talk about how we can create hope. Edward talked about the fact that we spoke at COP25, and I was honored to be able to present findings about soil in mitigating climate change. And I talked about the soil, of course, but to me, the giant change is never going to come if we don't put it in context. Context is always critical to creating an inspiring change. So I presented something called the 2 halves of solving climate change. Not the 2 solutions, but 1 solution with 2 integrated and interdependent parts. Today, the world is finally waking up to what some scientists have been telling us for years, which is that no amount of emission reduction, no move to carbon neutral anything. I mean, even if I had a magic wand right now and I could stop all emissions before I stopped talking, it's not going to do a thing to solve climate change if we don't also draw down that 1 trillion tons of legacy CO2 that Tom talked about earlier. But how inspiring is it to know that humanity can do this? Not alone, but in the spirit of Ubuntu, we can do it with nature, that amazing thing that we're a part of. How incredible is it as we learn that what we've done for energy, we might also do for the soil, and that those 2 halves might provide the solution that we need. So today, we're able to dramatically reduce emissions because nature is supplying the energy. Nature is providing the wind and the solar and the geothermal to replace that energy that's killing the planet. Well, today, I'm happy to say nature is dying to help us on the other side as well. Nature is dying to help humanity rise. And to fully understand this opportunity, I want to take you back about 250 years, just before the Industrial Revolution. And 250 years ago, we industrialized the production of energy, and it changed the world forever. The progress was astonishing over that period, and it was all good until it wasn't. In fact, that progress took us to the moon. We put a man on the moon in 1969. But the very next year, 1970, is when we first learned about global warming. So that wonderful progress might just be taking the planet down with it. Now, the other half of the Industrial Revolution, which we don't talk about as much, was the industrialization of food production. So we had energy and food production being industrialized. But yet today, virtually every agreement being discussed at COP, and you just heard it, has to do with reducing emissions one way or another. Country after country after country is making commitments to cut emissions in half, or to go carbon neutral, or to get lower emissions of methane. And why are they doing this? Well, they're doing it because they can. Because humanity has developed the technology to do that. Because we've made it cheaper and plentiful. And we're making huge strides in storing renewable energy. So today, what I'm asking you, what I'm asking all of us, is to focus on the food side with the same commitment we've used to focus on the energy side. You've heard the science today. You know how nature, we all know how nature uses photosynthesis to draw carbon back down and return it to the soil. And we all now know that nature's no longer doing it the way she used to do it, the way she can do it, because industrial agriculture has killed our soil. The United Nations, in fact, the United Nations Committee on Trade and Development, no less, told us this back in 2013. They wrote a wonderful white paper that said, wake up before it's too late. Wake up, humanity, before it's too late. Let's hope it isn't. Jim said earlier, we may only have 3 or 4 years. We know we can do a lot. We've also heard that we can restore soil health. Heard that here on this call. That in under 1 year, we can restore soil and get it to the point where it is again pulling carbon back down from the atmosphere and relieving pressure on the climate. We know that we can regenerate the soil. And thus we know that we can regenerate the health of the planet. You saw Dr. Ratan Lal's chart. He may be the most respected voice on this subject, telling us that restoring our soil could draw so much carbon back down that we could reduce parts per million by over 150. Do you know where that puts us? It's interesting to remind ourselves. That puts us to the level we were at right before the Industrial Revolution. Interesting. 8 years ago, with Tom Newmark, I co-founded the Carbon Underground with the mission, with the hope to accelerate a transformation from industrial to regenerative agriculture that would draw down our legacy carbon. And with no disrespect to the UN and the governments of the world, and certainly not to the people of the world, we have focused primarily on business to lead this transformation. Now, we did that because business, love it or not, has the greatest power to make this happen and to make it happen quickly. Food is the #1 industry in the world, $7.7 trillion a year. Fiber, also critically dependent on healthy soil, is #3 at $3.5 trillion. Now, all of these companies in these industries already know about climate change, and they've looked at the costs of trying to fight it. The costs, not the investment. So we didn't talk about climate change much, certainly not when we got started. We talked about how waking up about soil, as the UN asks us to do before it's too late, as they warned us, would make them more money. It would increase the security of their supply chain. It would increase food security for the planet in general. It would restore fresh water. It would grow more nutrient-dense food that could reduce healthcare costs globally by trillions of dollars a year. Oh, and if they want to, especially if they're a consumer-focused company, they can also tell their customers that they help to reverse climate change. So the Carbon Underground is focused on creating tools, like the first critical standard definition for regenerative agriculture. That way, business and organizations could talk in the same language. More than 400 companies and organizations signed on. We launched the Soil Carbon Initiative, which was a verifiable standard to measure the impact of actions on soil health. But we launched it with powerful companies like Danone, General Mills, and Unilever's, Ben & Jerry's, and 150 other stakeholders. And I'm happy to report some progress. Last year, There was more money invested in regenerative projects in the US alone than the size of the entire organic food industry. $57 billion last year, and it's only going up. That's hopeful. That's from zero. One of the biggest food chains in the world, called Regenerative, the #1 food trend. That's hopeful. Giant food companies, many of them, are committing $1 billion apiece to convert their practices to regenerative. That's hopeful. France's 4 per 1,000 program to restore soil and draw down carbon has nearly 50 countries and 1,000 organizations on board. That's hopeful, maybe more hopeful than COP26. A couple of years ago, we created a program to allow the public to do something. It's called Adopt a Meter. And for $5 or whatever your local equivalent is, you can adopt a meter of dead or degraded soil, and we will restore a meter. And as I said earlier, within a year, it's pulling carbon back down. I'm happy to say that so far we're just about at the restoration of 100 million meters. Not a lot of land, but a lot of hope. And we're growing quickly. And like on the energy side, all of what I'm talking about here today is being done with nature and no longer against nature. Nature's figured this out. You know, we've heard today that we need to go from 420 parts per million to 280. So listen to this. Nature, before humanity, took parts per million after volcanic periods from 7,000 back to 280. We only needed to do 3% of that right now. So here's my ask. Let's look at solving climate change as a two-part, equally important solution. We need to push ourselves. We need to push each other. We need to push our representatives at COP26 and everywhere else to create the same types of policies and incentives and agreements to fix the food side as we're doing with the energy side. We need to make industrial agriculture, that phrase, that activity, the equal of fossil fuels in the discussion of fighting climate change. Basically, what we need to do is we need to focus as much on drawing down the legacy carbon as we do on preventing additional carbon from going up. That's hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you. Hope. Let's build hope. Yes, and so now we will hear from the grazing industry, from Savory Institute. Abbey, please.
Hi. Thank you, Edward. Yeah, I have a few things to share. While I'm loading this up, I just wanted to say that I'm just so grateful to be here and to be welcome to speak from the heart, as Jim said, and to be amongst friends, as Edward said. So really honored to be in this conversation with you. My name is Abbey Smith, and I'm the Savory Global Network coordinator. That means I get to work with people all around the world who are working in their very specific context, their ecological context, their cultural context, their economic context, to regenerate land through a decision-making and planning procedure called holistic management. And I want to talk to you today about what holistic management is and how we mimic nature to bring a biological solution to climate change. So I think that this is queued up so beautifully, and so much of the story that I need to tell usually has been told by Larry, it's been told by Edward. So these circles on the map, these were presented in Alan Savory's TED Talk, and they're the grasslands of the world, that 3.5 billion hectares of land that are now desertifying. And Alan describes desertification as a fancy way of saying that land is turning to desert. So these are parts of the world where there used to be big, huge herds of herbivores that would go across the land, and they would be bunched and moving by pack hunting predators. And they evolved, these big herds evolved with the predators, and they also evolved with the grasses and with the soil life that was so beautifully described by Tom. So our solution is to use animals, use livestock in particular, to mimic these old patterns and to bring back that life in the soil and in the grasslands, which again pull down the carbon as was explained earlier. So sometimes we use animals like this, like bison in North America. This is one of our learning centers. But we also can use all types of livestock to mimic those patterns that evolved. And it's such a common sense solution. And I feel like, in this conversation, it's so important to sometimes get out of our heads and get into our hearts. And that's why I love the way that this was introduced. And if you have the opportunity to go onto a piece of land that is fully alive, a place that maybe Eduard is managing, or someone is a regenerative farmer in your area, you just know, your heart knows, your body knows that this is right, because there's so much life there. And if you then go and stand on land that has been extracted for years and years through chemical and industrial agriculture, there's no life in it. And the food that comes from it does not have nutrients or health benefits, really. It's just a lot of empty calories held together that look in containers that look like fruit and vegetables. And I think that when you are on that land that is alive, the first time I really felt it was at the Africa Center in Zimbabwe, our other learning center for the Savory Institute, our international campus, and where I had my first formal training in holistic management. And it is completely different. It feels completely different than land that I've ever felt before. And it feels right. Sometimes I think we need to trust our instincts and our intuition in this conversation. So holistic management is very common sense. It's about timing. And so I think of Leslie's story in the beginning about her farm in Portugal, her 11 acres, that was her dream. And I wish that we could have connected her to a holistic management teacher or a farmer to help know what to do when. And that's really what holistic management is about. And it helps us tie our decisions that we make and the actions that we take on the land and our behavior back to the ecosystem. And what I love about it so much, and why I continue to practice it and teach it and be part of this movement, is that it is the only decision-making framework that ties our actions back to the environment. So we're considering our impact on the whole with each action that we take. And over time, it becomes very, very intuitive. And then the planning procedures of holistic management are really about getting animals to the right place at the right time to have the impact that we want, to create the outcomes that we need. And it's very, very practical. But this is where what I appreciate about these planning procedures is that they don't have barriers to entry. We teach these to communities in Africa using storytelling. So there's no need to be literate to be able to read or to do math or any of those things. It's about moving animals across the land. It's about considering the whole when we're making decisions. And it's truly a biological solution. And it's hard to be part of that conversation and feel valid when so many solutions that are revered are technology based. And I think as we believe so much in technology, but what I love about being in this group is that there is the belief, as Tom was saying, that the earth can do this. And this is the role that we play to help land it, to bring these ideas and these actions down to earth and truly, decision after decision, one step at a time, begin to bring life back into the land and to build the soil. So this is an example of a grazing chart. This would go on the wall. It would be done by the whole team and the decision makers, and you're moving the cattle across the land, you're adapting, you're looking at the feedback and revising the plan. But this is it. This is what it takes, pen and paper and thought. And then this is the outcomes that come from it. I just love these pictures. To me, this is the virtual version of being on the land and actually feeling it yourself. But this is the Africa Center in Zimbabwe, going from, this is simply changing management, using herding. Another place in Zimbabwe where we're just using animals to bring life back to the land. This is in Australia after a fire. Namibia. And then this is usually those are before and after pictures that I was showing you. And this one is land in the same area, about a 5-minute drive apart. So this is the Africa Center for Holistic Management. Here's one of the herders, which is a very revered position. It's like a firefighter or a nurse. They work in shifts, in 24-hour shifts, and they're with the animals, protecting them from predators, and they're coexisting with wildlife. So there's all the big predators are there, and it works out. So when I went to the Africa Center for the first time, I thought all of Zimbabwe looked like this, with this grass that's over your head and so much diversity, so much life, these creeks and rivers running. And then we left the Africa Center, we went to the national park nearby, and this is what it looked like, full of bare land, hardly any wildlife, and completely different feeling. So the way that we do this work is together. Really believe that we are better together. If you want to hear more about this story and how Alan came to these insights that we call holistic management, his TED Talk is a really great place to start. We operate as a network, so we believe in nodal and decentralized organizations, and we don't want to be this big entity pushing anything or forcing anything. And so we offer, as the Savory Institute, the body of knowledge of holistic management, which is constantly updated by the learnings of the network and then redistributed out to the network. And then our partner organizations, which we call hubs, they operate in their part of the world, in their context, to bring holistic management and the practices of regenerative agriculture to their area in a way that's very accessible to all people. And then we have ways of monitoring the outcomes so that we're actually measuring the entire uplift of the ecosystem. Something that really worries me about this conversation is that we're applying still reductionist thinking to a complex problem, and we're chasing things that don't really paint the true picture, and they're very easy to manipulate. So we try, again, our roots are in holistic management. So in our monitoring, we look at the whole system and we want to see entire ecological uplift. So we're measuring a lot of different indicators of that. It's work to get all those data points, but in a space that I feel could be really easily manipulated and greenwashed, it's really important to have sound data. And I think that's what, we can feel good about that we're doing the work to put the carbon in the soil, and we're measuring it in a way that has integrity. And we're working with people and meeting them where they are in their context. And that's really what we're all about. I'm happy to answer questions, but that is our work at the Savory Institute.
Thank you, Abby. And thank you for all your support. We actually launched the beginnings of a Savory Hub in January this year in Costa Rica. I'll talk a bit about that at the end of the program. But now the Ministry of Agriculture actually asked us if they could join their 1,500 farms that they're following and really convert them into. So we're talking about large scale here. Thank you, Abby. Let me call Mel Landers. He's been working on systematization of indigenous agriculture for 5 decades, and he has joined our team here at the university in our Regenerate Costa Rica project. So Mel, ahead to you, please.
Thank you, Edward. I'll be detailing how regenerative agriculture provides real solutions to problems of food insecurity and climate instability, among others. Let me bring up some slides. Uh-oh. I don't remember how to do it.
How to share.
You go to screen share, the green button
Share.
at the bottom.
Okay.
Screen share.
Okay. He said it's at the bottom.
At the bottom of the screen, there's a green icon that says screen share screen.
Yeah, let me go back and try again.
You choose which screen you want to share.
Well, I don't see it at the bottom of the screen.
Where you have your microphone, you have your video, the raise hand, the record, Q&A.
Oh, okay. I see. Okay. Share screen. Is that what you're saying? Share screen. Okay. It's still not working. I'm just going to talk. I don't have to have the slides. They would have helped a little bit, but I'm just going to talk to you all. As Tom said, the Earth's soils were originally generated by the microorganisms which decompose rock and.
Go ahead, we're listening.
No, the recording is going. Sorry.
We can hear you, Mel.
Yeah, you can hear me. I'm not going to worry about the slides. Like I said, as Tom said, the Earth's soils were originally generated by the microorganisms which decompose rock and by the microorganisms which decompose dead plant matter. So to properly regenerate the soils that have been depleted and eroded by tillage agriculture, we need to put those microbes back to work. The logical strategy is to do what is necessary to enable those microorganisms to regenerate damaged soils, mainly by harvesting the rain and by keeping the soil continually covered with decaying organic matter, mulch, just as it is in natural grasslands and forests. This is not a radical new proposal. The science has been there for decades. It's just taking a long time to convince decision makers that it's necessary to do what the science says must be done. You, Edward, are aware of the struggle I've had to mainstream the ancient indigenous American farming practices, even though 14 years ago, the IPCC recommended their adoption as the way to both adapt to and to mitigate the effects of climate change. The ancient indigenous practices capture enormous amounts of carbon dioxide in the soil, enriching it and increasing its water holding capacity and fertility each year. It's just one among a number of important regenerative practices that are being ignored by policymakers, some of which are taught by the organizations represented by members of this panel. In the newly released report from the Africa Regenerative Agriculture Study Group, they lay out the case for applying regenerative soil practices in order to stem hunger, increase employment, reduce production costs while increasing output, improve economies, and reduce atmospheric carbon levels. This is what they found. To restore degraded lands in Africa, regenerative agriculture practices such as crop diversification, tree planting, reduced tillage, mulching, and water conservation techniques spur benefits for agribusiness, small farms, and society. Increased uptake of regenerative agriculture in Africa could support nearly 5 million jobs by 2040. That's additional jobs, in addition to increasing revenue and food security for smallholder farmers. Regenerative farming systems could greatly increase yields and reduce input costs to farmers, with yields already increasing by up to 300%. Regenerative agriculture could also sequester large amounts of carbon dioxide, making it a low-cost and effective solution to combat climate change. They're speaking the truth. What the working group shows is that regenerative agriculture in Africa could sequester 4.4 gigatons of additional soil carbon by 2040, with an additional 1 million megatons per year just from agroforestry and just in Africa. We really can't wait for the politicians and others like in COP26 to follow the science and make decisions based on what is best for humanity. We have no choice but to do it ourselves. Just as Costa Rica Regenerativa, the Carbon Underground, the Center for Regenerative Agriculture, the Savory Institute, and other regenerative organizations are now doing. At the Global Evergreening Alliance, we're beginning huge campaigns, but we have a lot to learn from these other organizations. The fact is that soil carbon sequestration is the fastest, cheapest, and most effective method of lowering atmospheric carbon levels. It does wonders for small farmers, and it's outside of the Earth's ocean, soils have the greatest potential for storing carbon. So what are we waiting for? We're out of time. Yes, we have hope, but we're out of time to take action. We have to teach tens of millions of farmers, mainly poor farmers in the remote areas, how to support organisms in regenerating their soils. Each farm is different, so we have to teach the full range of regenerative practices in order to provide them with the skills they need to survive on their own lands, in their own situations on those farms. But to do that appropriately, we have to mimic nature. To do that, we have to correct a long-held belief that is doing more harm than good. A lot of people don't like what I have to say, but we have to replace organic agriculture's focus on producing compost with a focus on mulch. Mulch is what provides the environment and much of the nutrients needed by the organisms that produce stable organic compounds in the soil. Although compost is viable for urban agriculture using food waste, it's not sustainable for farms. Almost 40% of the carbohydrates in crop waste are lost to the atmosphere in the production of compost. And almost no farm can produce enough biomass for both mulch and compost, even if they're utilizing green manure cover crops in their systems. And keeping the soil continually covered is an absolute necessity. The microbes will supply the fertility if we give them mulch. This is what soil organisms actually require in order to enable us to have good production. 100% of the rain on dry soils. The cool, moist environment provided by mulch. Almost no soil disturbance and its accompanying erosion. Minimal compaction of the soil from equipment, rain, animals, and foot traffic. No toxic chemicals or harsh fertilizers. And the presence of living roots, continually available to those organisms that depend on root exudates, such as the mycorrhizal fungi, which increase soil carbon by about 20, they account for about 20% of the increase in soil carbon each year. That means that we must incorporate trees and shrubs in all of our production systems, including those in grasslands and grassland grazing. Agroforestry is vitally important to the regeneration of soils, even on grasslands. If we can teach these tens of millions of farmers to provide those necessities to their soil microorganisms, those tiny creatures will achieve many amazing accomplishments for us. Farm families will produce more food, including a healthier variety of foods. They will have food sovereignty and security because they'll produce their own inputs. Their livelihoods will be improved and become more resistant to economic downturns each year, and they'll become more resilient. The microbes will release nutrients from rock and nitrogen, other things that they do to increase fertility in the soil. Because the farmers will regenerate life in the soil by giving the right environment to these microorganisms. The carbohydrates that they put in the soil will be converted to stable carbon compounds, both active and stable humus, by those soil microbes, by some of them. The soil will once again have a good structure that facilitates drainage and proper gas exchange. The humus will capture and store the nutrients that are in solution in the water in the soil. That organic sponge will greatly increase the soil moisture content. The USDA has proven that each 1% increase in soil organic matter content in the top 6 inches of soil enables the soil to retain an additional 27,000 gallons of water per acre. That's thousands of barrels of extra water per per hectare available to crops. If 100% of the rain is captured, like in the indigenous American system, crops actually become drought resistant. Increased soil fertility and moisture will increase plant growth, which will increase photosynthesis, which will cool the air. Cool air takes up less space. It contracts and it pulls air from outside the area. And this can pull air, moisture-laden air in from bodies of water in order to increase rain over landscapes. And we can actually re-wet landscapes, which is one of the key things that I'm trying to accomplish. If we teach farmers to provide what the soil microbes need, there will also be a significant reduction in atmospheric carbon levels, amounting to many gigatons per year, significant enough to begin reversing the warming of the oceans and the atmosphere, hopefully soon enough to prevent the worst effects of severe climate instability. This is achievable. I just detailed how it works, and there's more to this story, but it's available to anyone who wants to know about it. And there is hope. We just need to stop waiting for the participation of people who don't care. All of us who do care need to get to work, and we needed to get to work immediately. Thank you, Edward.
Thank you, Mel. Mel is a holder of wisdom and very inspiring. Before we go to questions, I just want to share very quickly what we're doing here in Costa Rica, because I'm not using these friends just to bring them to webinars. We're actually learning from all of their efforts and applying it to a bioregion, starting in Guanacaste, which is that peninsula on the northern part of Costa Rica, very well known for tourists. But the basis is we build the future we want. So instead of fighting the system, like Buck Fuller said, we're building a new system. We believe we can build the future we want, and we'll make the old model obsolete. So just very quickly, it's amazing how quickly nature here in the tropics just plays with us. We gave a vacation a few months ago during the COVID initial phase, and nature just showed how marvelous it is and how willing to collaborate. It has sent us so many warnings, and we just didn't pay attention, mainly because those warnings, storms, droughts, and everything affected the most vulnerable. It just sent us I think its last present in form of a virus, which we cannot even see, that put everybody on its knees. No matter if it's a Hollywood actor or a refugee from Syria, we all need to start thinking about how to actually work with nature and be part of nature. So we've been adopting these different methodologies and trying them out. This is a food farm. One of our donors fed 27,000 people during the initial part of the pandemic. And he said, I just cannot keep it up for a long time. Let's start teaching them to produce food. And we were told farmers here couldn't produce because there were no farmers, and that it was almost impossible to produce any food here because it's very dry or very wet. And we had 2 hurricanes in a row. These are photos of family farms that's kept on growing during the 2 hurricanes. Everything else was flooded and eroded, and it just kept on going. We've transformed this dry land when everybody told us you can't grow anything there. This is a community farm. They produce up to 10 tons of food, more than 35 different food types in 1 hectare, just 3 months after starting working with them. And now they're actually selling the excess to the markets and being able to pay their telephones and their electricity bills and their basic needs. This has also helped us transform this degraded land to a beautiful regenerative system where we're now counting 177 species of insects and arthropods that have come back to this farm. And not only that, phosphorus is 10 times more available in this 1 hectare than 50 meters away from it in the gallery forest, and 50 times higher than in the degraded soil where we started on just less than a year ago. So it's just magic to see how life comes to help us face all these big challenges. And besides producing healthy, good tasting food without any drop of chemicals, we are saving the planet, like Larry said. And we're empowering kids, we're teaching local communities to know that they can build their future, and that's about hope. And this is Mel's contribution now. We're going to the food forest, and we sure want to learn from Tom and his farm, Finca Luna Nueva, which is already a food forest. And if every single house in my country had these food forests, we wouldn't need a single Walmart bringing us food to the table and ruining our farmers. We need to recover agrobiodiversity, very importantly. We have so much genetic material out there that could have the genes to help us face the challenges we're facing with global change. And with holistic grazing, as I mentioned in January, we already had staff trained by Savory, and we're now running 10 farms. We're moving from really degraded pastures and badly managed cattle to regenerative. We have 10 farms on our own as a project, but we're now collaborating with 1,500 farms from the Ministry of Agriculture. And it's business. We can duplicate or triplicate the amount of cows per hectare. So farmers are looking into this for making more money, and by the way, saving the planet, fixing carbon, bringing biodiversity back. So it's just, again, proving that you can do it differently, making it economic, making it socially just, making it good for life on Earth, and not only human life, and having then others hop onto the initiative. So with that, I would like to open up for questions or discussions, or if anybody from the panel wants to add something, we can all turn on our cameras and have a good chat. I know Tom and Larry have to go in a few minutes, but please, welcome to any comments, questions. Anybody that has been following the questions in the chat, go ahead.
Mel, did you want to talk about Dita's question?
Well, I can address it. I'm no expert, but in general, what needs to happen and to put people back on land is there needs to be an investment. And this is an area where corporations, millionaires and billionaires can help us to a great extent, is to invest money in buying large farms, splitting that up amongst people who want to go into farming. Those farmers who are selling their farms, hopefully can stick around to teach agronomy, this sort of thing, to those new farmers. But those new farmers need to learn from us in the regenerative agriculture course at Costa Rica Regenerativa, or other courses, depending on what they want to do with those farms. They need to learn regenerative agriculture, and the farmers who are retiring can help them with how the weather works and these other things that are also involved with that. So it's a matter of investment to buy farmland and split that up amongst small farmers, or people, small farmers who are already farming but don't have enough land, or young people who want to go into farming.
We actually have one excellent donor who fed all those people that is already looking at farms to buy and then opening it up for people who want to produce. This is what we need. This is a real human coming up and saying, yeah, I was lucky in the economic world. Now I want my kids to be lucky in the living world.
We need more wonderful humans like him.
Dita and then Tom. Dita.
Thank you, and thank you for this amazingly hope-bringing show of amazing places. I feel really invigorated. Yeah, I think that's a brilliant suggestion. I guess my worry is what are there strings attached when we have big corporations or big money buying big pieces of land, and then how that trickles out down into things. There's a project that is about to start in England that is called Common Ground. I don't think I have a website yet, but it sounds like a really beautiful thing that can be modular and distribute around. And their principle is they're buying relatively small land. It's a private investment, and they are doing like what you said, Mel, distributing it into small areas to farmers that are all going to comply with regenerative agriculture. And then the way that the financial side works is that everything is divided by 3. So as a farmer, if I'm there with my small piece of land, all what I earn is I divide into 3. A third goes into the project, so it's for shared infrastructure, workshops, knowledge, etc. A third is for myself, so that's my profit, and a third goes into buying more land for the same project. And they are starting with a very small, it was surprisingly little. But I think this is the type of projects that also need to be broadcasted and activated, and people who have that possibility just start doing it somewhere else. Because yeah, I think distributing land to the people who want to farm and don't have that problem of being called a farmer, it's probably a solution for climate change as well.
Thank you. Tom.
I think it's a really important question, and it highlights a deficiency in the status quo. Under current accounting principles, corporations are in fact encouraged to externalize ecosystem damage because it doesn't affect their bottom line. But we know the consequences of externalizing the ecological costs of destructive industrial agriculture. But is there a way, using current technology, to really measure the ecosystem services and benefits that can flow from regenerative agriculture? And that's where we're not quite ready to be able to measure with the precision needed to really encourage the flow of the trillions of dollars that are surrounding this regenerative opportunity. So what many people in the regenerative movement believe is we are on the cusp of the technology needed to measure the ecosystem benefits being created by the smallholder farmers and the small farmers around the world. And that will enable the flow of reward to those farmers that will support the revolution of regenerative agriculture that is needed. So I want to encourage everyone that although the current technology has not been precise enough to support those ecosystem payments, many of us believe that we're on the cusp of that. And I would think in the immediate years to come, we're going to see a dramatic flow of capital rewarding regenerative farmers.
Definitely. Yeah, Costa Rica actually worked a lot on valuing ecosystem services in the past. And we're now incorporating the valuation of ecosystem services. A young economist, Marcelo, is joining our team. He actually studied with Bob Constanza. I think it is essential to actually relate the ecosystem services in general to the benefits for humanity, not only the money wise. I think we made a mistake back in the 90s of only putting money value to ecosystem services, but we need to look at the life value and all the interrelatedness of producing good food. We get rid of all these pathologies that are affecting our children, our adults, the levels of cancer. Just take that into account and put that into the bill. So it's not a linear measurement, what we need. It's actually looking at this huge spectrum of good things happening. And as a side effect, we save the planet. So any way you look at it, it's a win-win-win. Somebody else.
I'd like to answer an important question from Charles Bensinger, if I may. He asked, how can we deploy regenerative farming on lands that must deal with 7 months of cold winter weather? And I did that for 20 years in Missouri, and I know how to do that. Regenerative agriculture works very well in northern climates. Actually, there are some advantages in having the soil frozen for 7 months, as far as allowing organic matter to build up in the soil, because the microorganisms during that time are not busy decomposing it. So you can actually, if you do it right, sequester more carbon in the soil in a northern climate than you can in a tropical climate if you're doing things correctly. And you do need mulch for that. In the first 3 years I was on my farm, I increased the soil organic matter content by 3%. And that's possible for any farmer, including grazers, to do this sort of thing in the Northern Hemisphere. And there's more information that can be given later.
Thank you. Thank you, Mel. Larry.
Yeah, I just wanted to make an additional comment on that, as far as cold climates, I think what Charles would bring up is a really excellent point, that what works in one place may not work the same way in another place. And it, certainly we, a couple of years ago, we were working with Ben and Jerry's in Vermont, and there were challenges to achieve results that we didn't have, say, in Iowa or certainly in the tropics. But we also work a lot in Finland and in Sweden and other places where, it is certainly a cold climate, and they're learning to do things that are appropriate for them. And I will say that regenerative agriculture is probably becoming more of a pervasive practice in some of those places than in some of the other places where it might be easier to achieve initial results. So, happy to share information on that, but the results are pretty exciting there as well, accepting the challenges that come.
I can give a pretty quick explanation to those that want an explanation right now. You need as thick of a mulch as possible over winter to protect the soil, especially the soil organisms. Once you have sun, you need to take that mulch aside and let the soil heat up, and then reapply it for the entire growing season. That really works wonders.
Wisdom again. Thank you, Mel. Anybody else wants to add something? We're getting close to the closing hour.
I would just add a note there. I think that as humans, we are naturally tool using and reductionist thinkers. And it's been so hard, I know, for myself to change to a holistic perspective and always consider context. And that's where I think these, differences between what can work in Costa Rica and what works in Missouri are so important. They're such important questions. And it takes really getting to know the land and seeing the cycles of it and mimicking that natural process, and not just applying practices because they worked somewhere. They might not work in your place. We're
not talking about recipes. We're talking about principles, about common sense. So don't look for recipes. Yes. And that's why we have to have capacity development, because every place has to develop its own solutions. That's the bioregional approach is critical in this. And we have several bioregional networks now coming together so we can actually co-create solutions that work in different places based on the principles. So I think we can if we mainstream fast enough and we have the resources to mainstream fast enough, we can turn this around by the next COP.
You're an ambitious man, Mr. Muller. We're going to turn it around.
Only way to survive.
Good for you. Well, thank you all so much for this session today. It's been very, very inspiring as we begin our thematic program over the next couple of days. I think just as we close out here, I would just love to hear, just in a minute or so, from each of you. Just a closing thought that you may want to share with our audience about carbon sequestration and regenerative agriculture as we bring this session to a close. Maybe starting with you, Tom.
Well, I appreciate your giving me the opportunity up front, because I'm going to push back even on the term carbon sequestration. Because carbon sequestration makes it all sound so inert and so and so structural. When what we're really talking about is a living ecosystem. All of us have been talking about the power of the biology of a living planet to create the environment that is supportive to the continuation of life. The Gaia hypothesis is more than a hypothesis. It's the fact. And we need to stop, I think we need to stop thinking in terms of the soil being a sink into which carbon is locked away, captured and stored, and instead think of soil as the tissue of a vital ecosystem where carbon is drawn down by photosynthesis and incorporated into the living tissue where it does work. And so to me, the takeaway from this talk and from the work that the Carbon Underground is doing is it's all about biology. It's all about promoting biodiversity above ground, which promotes biodiversity below ground. And we need to shift the mindset from sink to living tissue, and don't underestimate the vigor of an athletic Mother Earth.
Well put. Thank you. Mel.
Well, I'd like everyone to take the environmental biologist perspective on what needs to be done. That's what's enabled me to come to a great understanding of how this is going to work. We need to, I guess, manipulate the damaged systems in order to bring them back to a natural system, in order to provide what is needed for soil the soil microbiome in each environment, each ecoregion, each farm field. We need to take the perspective of what do I need to do to help those organisms survive, thrive, and do the work that's needed to make the soil more productive, more healthy, etc. Okay, but we need to also take the teacher's perspective, because we have to teach farmers to teach other farmers, who will then teach other farmers, and to scale this up millions of times over across all of the landscapes on Earth.
Great, thank you. Did Abby disappear? I think she just disappeared. So we'll go to Larry.
Thank you. This has been amazing. And I want to thank everybody for inspiring me, and Edward and everybody for putting this together, especially Humanity Rising. I just want to sort of react to the report from COP26 that we got a little while ago. I found it very depressing, but not surprising whatsoever. They were meeting to talk about cleaning up our planet. If my child told me the 26th time that she's going to clean up her room, I wouldn't have a whole lot of confidence in that either. And I want us to remember that when we talk about who's going to do this work and who can do this work, we had 200 leaders roughly in Glasgow. There are 500 million farms on this planet. There are 2 billion people who work the land on this planet, and there is nature. And I would put my hope on all of them. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. Abby.
Yes, thank you. I was rapidly searching for that paper that was requested in the chat. I just want to say how grateful I am to have met all of you and to be part of this conversation. And I believe that we are part of the solution. And I think you might have said it, or Edward, but I think these are the greatest people on earth, and we need to stick together and be together. I've noticed in the Savory Global Network that there's such a desire for people to come together and not feel so isolated and alone. And so thank you for this reminder that we aren't alone and that there is hope and there is solution, and they're so practical and accessible. So we can do this.
Thank you, Abby. And Ed, final word.
Well, you know me, hope with big capital letters, and we build the future we want. And I'm not going to pay attention to any of the naysayers and any of the people who say, but, I've heard too many buts in my life. And we just have everything in our hands to do it. We know everything we need. I always say this is the best scientifically documented planetary extinction. And we just have to use that knowledge to create wisdom instead of just more data. So we have the conditions, and all we need to do is come together and mainstream this very quickly. So let's do it. Thank you, Jim, for opening the session. Thank you to my great friends and panelists who brought all this joy to this discussion. I'm gonna re-listen to this several times to get my hopes up every morning. Thank you all.
Well, I think that the comment that we in the end we can rely on the athleticism of the planet, of Mother Nature, to help us at this critical hour. That's such a potent point for all of us to hold. Now, just quickly before we go, there's a request for a group photo. So if all of you could open up your videos, we want to take a group photo for posterity in our archives of this momentous program on the COP. Stanley will take the photo. And I want to welcome everybody to the after chat. We have a session that begins immediately after this is over. I know some of you have to go, but those of you listening or any of the panelists are welcome to join. And then tomorrow, we're going to look at the whole issue of species extinction and those species around the world that are endangered. It's being convened by Tom Eddington, who's the founder of the NGO called Endangered. He's been doing extraordinary work globally to mobilize attention on the massive acceleration of extinctions of species worldwide, which now possibly down the road might include us. So we wanted to touch into that dimension of climate change starting tomorrow. And then don't forget to go on to globalregenerationcorps.org to sign up and join the Hive. Leslie will be back tomorrow to tell us a little bit more about it. But Ed, thank you, brother. Thank you. And Abby and Tom and Mel and Larry, thank you so much. This has been a powerful, optimistic way to start our thematic program for this COP. See you tomorrow, everyone. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Great session.
Bye.